Awesome. Okay, well, thank you all for having me. Um, my name is Colin Swider. I work at the Elephant Listening Project, or ELP. That's at the Kaylee C. Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And a lot of what I do at ELP involves using passive acoustic monitoring, or PAM, to detect vocalizations of African forest elephants and look for patterns across large areas of rainforest in the Congo Basin. But we can also acoustically detect gunshots from illegal gun hunting and analyze spatial and temporal patterns in these as well. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So, as many of us are aware, illegal gun hunting is causing biodiversity loss worldwide. And where we work in Central Africa, this includes both illegal bushmeat hunting as well as poaching of African forest elephants for ivory. And so, throughout the talk, sometimes I'll collectively refer to both of these activities as illegal gun hunting. And it's a major problem for biodiversity and ecosystem health, and we're trying to understand it better using passive acoustics. So the idea is to use PAM to build upon previous illegal gun hunting research and advance our understanding of where and when these activities occur so that we can optimize the use of conservation law enforcement resources such as anti-poaching patrols. So the vast majority of poaching research thus far has looked at very large spatial scales, so regional, national, or international drivers of poaching pressure, such as poverty or corruption, for example. And that's great information to have, but it doesn't really help with predicting poaching on the ground and planning patrol routes. So we're trying to use PAM to identify the more proximate environmental predictors of gun hunting that could aid law enforcement. For example, are these activities occurring closer to certain landscape features like rivers and roads? Another benefit of using PAM is that we can collect data on these illegal activities with better spatio-temporal coverage and resolution than we would be able to obtain with more traditional means of sampling poaching events, such as by walking transects in search of signs of poaching. So with PAM, we can acoustically sample hundreds of square kilometers of terrain simultaneously, and we can sample continuously through time for months or even years, which is a huge improvement over methods like walked transects. And then importantly, PAM also really improves our capacity to analyze illegal gun hunting data in a systematically rigorous fashion. So poaching data have historically been collected opportunistically by anti-poaching patrols themselves as they're traveling their patrol routes. And these routes are often biased and based on prior knowledge or informant tips or previously detected illegal activity. So these data are not often systematically collected in a way that's amenable to statistical inference, which then hinders our ability to study the drivers of poaching. So we're trying to use PAM to remedy that issue because we can sample in a systematic and unbiased manner while incorporating random sampling and replication and facilitating statistical inference. So these ideas form the premise of this study and our justification for using PAM to advance our understanding of the determinants of gun hunting, which we hope will in turn aid conservation by helping to direct resources such as patrol effort in the most effective way. So the data for this project were collected at our study area in Nabali-Ndoki National Park in Republic of Congo. Here we have an acoustic grid of 50 recorders, which are these black dots. I hope you can see my cursor. These black dots on the map here. And this grid covers an area of 1,250 square kilometers, and it's been recording near continuously since late 2017. The grid covers a portion of the national park as well as these adjacent logging concessions, one of which is old and was logged over a decade ago, and the other which was being selectively logged throughout the study. So this is a good system for looking at potential interactions between gun hunting and logging as well. And we hypothesized that the levels of illegal gun hunting would be determined by two main factors: accessibility, how easy is it for poachers to get into an area, and deterrence, things that would dissuade poachers from exploiting an area. So for each of these 50 sites, we measured variables pertaining to accessibility, things like distance to permanent roads and networks of old logging roads, distance to the nearest major rivers, which are navigable by local canoes called pirogues, and so they can provide access just like roads can. Then we included whether or not there was ongoing logging associated with each site in each month, because previous research has shown logging to be associated with increased rates of bushmeat hunting. And then we included wet versus dry season months as an interaction with certain variables like distance to river, because rainfall will influence water levels in rivers and hence their navigability. We also had these deterrence variables such as anti-poaching patrol activity. So Wildlife Conservation Society provided us with their patrol routes, and I quantified the distance of foot patrols covered over different time periods and different distances from each site to represent patrol effort at a few different scales. We also included distance to nearest ranger outposts and overall level of protection, so national park versus the logging concessions. And then lastly, we accounted for a type of null hypothesis that poachers might simply be going to places with lots of animals to target, regardless of accessibility and deterrence factors. So as a type of control, I included detection rates of elephant rumble vocalizations at each site as a proxy for elephant relative abundance. And then we included habitat type because animal abundance and diversity should correlate with habitat in some way, and that could be relevant to a variety of bushmeat species. And habitat was especially important because it can also influence accessibility, because some forest types are much easier to travel through than others. I don't have time to go into many of the details, but essentially I used another form of remote sensing satellite imagery analysis to perform a supervised classification of habitat type across the entire study area. So again, these black dots are the recorder locations. And I classified each 30 meter by 30 meter pixel of area into one of three habitats. And the most important habitat type was mixed forest, because it has very high food resource availability, such as fruit. And so it's therefore potentially relevant to the animal abundance hypothesis. It's also relevant to the accessibility hypothesis because it has a very dense understory and it's often difficult to travel through. So to come up with a single habitat variable, a single metric that should relate to accessibility and animal abundance, I calculated the proportion of mixed forest within a 2 kilometer radius around each recorder, 2 kilometers being the approximate acoustic detection distance for gunshots. So again, going back to all these variables, the question is which of these covariates, if any, influence the distribution of gunshots that we detect across our PAM study system. And that distribution of gunshots looks like this. Over a period of about 3.5 years, we detected 86 gunfire events across these 50 recorders, and sites ranged from having 0 to up to 10 gunfire events indicated by the size of these red circles. And the events consisted of either single lone gunshots or sometimes groups of shots clustered together in time, which likely represented a single hunting attempt. And I analyzed this data in a time to event framework using Cox proportional hazards models extended for recurrent events. And this is a form of survival analysis. And the models basically can be used to quantify how risk changes over time and with respect to different variables of interest. So for the following graphs that I'm going to show, on the y-axis, we're going to have the model predicted number of gunfire events, which can be interpreted as risk of illegal hunting activity. On the x-axis is time since the study onset. So this shows a period of a few years starting in late 2017. And so each of these plots that I'll show is going to focus on one covariate at a time. And I used a standard information theory approach to compare models with different combinations of predictor variables and assess the importance of those covariates that I talked about. And certain covariates emerged as informative based on their occurrence in the top models, while others didn't appear at all. So I'm just going to go over and show plots for the ones for which we found support. So distance to rivers occurred in all the models of the top model set, and we therefore consider it to be the most important variable. If you look at these curves, you notice that the model predicted risk increases as time goes on, but that's simply because gunfire events accumulate over time. So that's not really the main takeaway. What you want to focus on here are the differences between these different curves, which represent different distances from rivers. We can see that risk is higher for sites closer to rivers than sites farther away, and that's likely because poachers are using rivers to access exploitable areas. There was strong evidence for the interaction between this distance to river effect and season, with this effect occurring only in the dry season. In the wet months, this effect really diminished. So during the low water levels of the dry season, those pirogues are likely confined to the deepest water courses. So this discrepancy in risk between the close versus the far sites is more pronounced. But in the wet season, I'm thinking that the water levels are rising and even tributaries may become navigable, allowing access to more distant sites and then diminishing this discrepancy in risk. So this pattern is really fitting with the idea that rivers are being used as avenues of access. One last thing I'll mention about this is that you could make the argument that poaching could have been higher near rivers because perhaps that's where more elephants are there. But to control for that, again, we included rumble detection rates as a proxy variable for relative abundance of elephants, and we found no support for that variable in the model selection process. So I think the influence of rivers seems to be related to accessibility. Habitat type also influenced the distribution of gunfire events. So sites surrounded by less mixed forest were at higher risk than sites characterized by more mixed forest. As I mentioned, this forest type is pretty hard to traverse because they have really dense understories compared to the open understories of the monodominant forests. And again, this hints at accessibility being an underlying factor because the forest types with more open understories, the lower proportion of mixed forest, are associated with higher risk. And then the final variable for which we found support was ongoing logging activity. So during the months and at the sites in close proximity to ongoing logging, the risk of gunfire event was substantially reduced. That actually contrasts with a couple previous studies that found increased illegal hunting in association with logging. And what we think is happening here is that these logging activities are driving bushmeat species and elephants out of the vicinity and resulting in unprofitable hunting conditions at those sites. But then as soon as the logging stops, those sites return to higher risk levels. So while the exact mechanism is unclear, this could be tentative evidence for the animal abundance hypothesis if in fact reduced animal abundance is resulting in lower hunting activity. So to conclude, I want to touch on a few other important takeaways. In this study, the risk of illegal gun hunting seems to be primarily determined by accessibility. And contrary to previous research, we found no evidence for any of our road-related variables, but rivers seem to be very important in this system, suggesting that rivers should be considered more carefully in future research. Forest type was also important, as well as ongoing logging activity, which actually reduced the risk, but only temporarily. And then another thing I wanted to make sure I touched on was the effective patrol effort. So with the Cox proportional hazards models and the time to event analysis, we found no deterrent effect of patrol effort, which seemed odd. But then when we looked at this further by sort of zooming out and considering patrol effort in a broader, more regional sense rather than site by site, when we looked at overall monthly patrol effort across the entire study grid, it did have a small effect and it reduced grid-wide gunfire event rates. So that suggests that the effective patrol effort is scale dependent, and the scale at which patrols are most effective needs to be further examined because that's one thing that will really help in optimizing the allocation of patrol resources. And then lastly, considering that the accessibility hypothesis received the most support, one recommendation for conservation and management would be to use all these variables and all these parameters that we talked about to estimate site-specific accessibility as a proxy for risk, and then to predict poaching hotspots and more effectively plan patrol routes. And with that, I'd like to give a shout out to all my co-authors who are working on this project with me and helping make it possible. And I'd like to thank you all for tuning in and listening. Not sure if there's time for questions, but I can also take questions over the app if that's easier. Thanks again.
Hi, Colin. Thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. It's really important for us to know that conservation monitoring efforts are practical in those ways. We do actually have one online question that we can do before time runs out.
Okay.
The question is
it in the chat?
Yeah, it's in the chat. Is there temporal separation between patrol efforts and gunshot events?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So because we weren't sure at what scale, temporal or spatial scale, patrol effort might have an impact, I decided to quantify patrol effort at multiple scales. So I quantified it over 2-week periods and 4-week periods, and at multiple spatial scales from each site. So it's kind of like this sliding window of patrol efforts over those 3.5 years, and then the gunshots were dispersed throughout those 3.5 years. So it wasn't just one static calculation of patrol effort. If that was your question, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you so much, Colin. That's all the time we have, so thank you again for your talk.
Okay, thank you for having me.